Cristian. Y
Hello, testing, English channel, testing.
Muy buenos días a todos y a todas. Bienvenidos, bienvenidas. Vamos a esperar unos
Good
minutos para
afternoon, everyone. We'll be waiting for a few minutes so that everyone can join.
Perfecto, vemos que ya se siguen sumando participantes. Vamos entonces a dar por iniciada la sesión de hoy día. Primero que todo, muchísimas gracias a cada uno y cada una de ustedes por sumarse el día de hoy a esta tercera sesión de la serie de webinarios Educación para el Desarrollo Sostenible y Restauración de Manglares como solución basada en la naturaleza en reservas de la biosfera de América Latina y el Caribe. Esta tercera sesión se basará principalmente sobre conocimientos locales e indígenas para la recuperación de manglares mediante soluciones basadas en la naturaleza y contaremos con una serie de presentaciones que nos harán cierto reflexionar sobre cómo la educación y cómo los conocimientos también de estas de comunidades locales pueden aportar a encontrar soluciones basadas en la naturaleza también y medios de organización que permitan la recuperación y restauración de los ecosistemas, en particular la de los manglares, pero contaremos hoy día también con una presentación que nos mostrará maneras de enfrentar esto en otros ecosistemas también. La educación para el desarrollo sostenible, y lo hemos mencionado en otras sesiones, es un proceso constante de enseñanza y aprendizaje integral y transformador, que brinda a las personas no solamente los conocimientos, sino también las habilidades, actitudes y valores para moldear un futuro sostenible, mejorar su calidad de vida, pero también el de las generaciones futuras, reevaluando qué aprendemos, cómo aprendemos y dónde aprendemos. Y es en ese marco, ¿cierto?, que se enfrasca esta iniciativa, que está financiada, ¿cierto?, y tiene el apoyo también del gobierno de Flandes, del Reino de Bélgica y el Organismo Autónomo de Parques Nacionales de España. Y UNESCO se encuentra implementando desde el año 2022 el proyecto Restauración de Manglares como solución basada en la naturaleza en reservas de la biosfera de América Latina. Y esta serie de webinarios se encuentra precisamente dentro de esa iniciativa. Así que para partir la sesión de hoy, quiero pasarle mi palabra a mi querida colega Serena Heckler, que viene de la oficina de UNESCO Montevideo, y ella es la coordinadora regional para América Latina y el Caribe del programa Hombre la Biosfera, donde están, por supuesto, las reservas de la biosfera y también el punto focal para el programa Links sobre conocimientos locales e indígenas. Así que adelante, Serena, qué gusto tenerte el día de acá hoy.
hola, muchas gracias, Cristian, por invitarme a participar en este webinario importante. Es un tema
To participating in this webinar, this is a very interesting topic, the intersection between local indigenous knowledge, the management of ecosystems, and what is important because of the value of carbon sequestration, providing goods and supplies to communities around the world, even Latin America and the Caribbean, and education. Education for life, not only formal education at schools, but also how knowledge is conveyed in the indigenous people and local communities. Restoration of mangroves is more complicated than just seeding the plants and expecting them or waiting for them to grow. We need to understand and tackle the causes for their loss, which has to do with multiple reasons, amongst which we have the impacts of climate change, climates in the quality of water, contamination or pollution, land reclamation and deforestation, non-sustainable harvesting of mangroves for local use, and the development of land on a higher scale stakeholders. In order to analyze these very complicated scenarios for the degradation of mangroves and these ecosystems, and to design restoration measures that are successful, we can have different main approaches. I'm going to mention three of them today. First of all, the scientific approach, where scientists may carry out studies on mangroves biodiversity, biochemistry, hydrology, the terrain itself, geoformation, national and local economies, and they design interventions based on all of the data that was gathered. Then they present these interventions and they indicate here we are going to plant these type of mangroves. Here we're going to recover the soil. Here we're going to have this other kind of economic activity for the local communities. So there's a negotiation there and the activity is rolled out. And the advantages of this approach is that there's a lot of quantitative data that can be used in order to design this intervention that can raise large-scale data, and certain kind of data are already systematized. We have a lot of information with even with long-term series like weather data or coverage laws in mangroves, data from 70, 80 years back. And this approach has an incidence with the decision makers, those that are in charge of large budgets. That is to say, it can attract resources and works with experts that can dedicate all of their time and expertise in order to resolve these challenges. They can dedicate themselves months or years of their lives to these projects. The disadvantages of this approach is that interventions may not be logical or sustainable for the indigenous people, the local communities living in the manglers, because they are designed with a logic that may perhaps not be a logic that is shared by those living in mangroves. And it depends on sectors. Some experts of one matter or the other, they might privilege partial solutions. And there are many examples of getting the initial cost lost, or some of the causes are not considered. That is to say, it could be a partial solution in not covering the whole complexity present. Finally, and as we've seen once and again, external scientists can have priorities that are different than those of indigenous peoples and local communities. For instance, if their priority is the conservation of mangroves or particular species that lives in the mangroves, or is the carbon sequestration, the projects may cause or increase conflicts that are internal or bit amongst different stakeholders, keep inequalities or not contributing to improve the well-being of those that live in or around mangroves. Another approach that I'm going to mention is the one that's based on local indigenous knowledge, where we work through traditional management systems and ancestral systems in order to consider the changes in the system as from their cosmovision and the logic of the local communities and indigenous peoples that are the ones that are more impacted with these changes. These systems are systems that are holistic in nature. That is, you cannot split ecologic, biologic, weather knowledge from social systems from religious systems and also emotional systems. Everything is intertwined. It's very difficult to pass on this knowledge to other cultural systems. So there are relevant challenges in carrying out this type of research. The advantages include the data include better knowledge of the local social ecological system, following the indigenous rights. The communities are defining the objectives of the intervention and they ensure their sustainability, whereas there are many cases where that doesn't happen in the project at the end. Many times, indigenous and local knowledge contain more detailed, sensitive, and accurate information about the impact of changes in the local system, and even considering historical events, in particular in countries in in the region, many areas have not been studied in detail by scientists, so they won't know exactly, for instance, how flooding may impact a hectare in particular, a mangrove in particular, in regions in Ecuador, Peru, or Panama coming from the rivers or the sea. But the community knows with safeguards such as those from the countries, the access of to benefits, Nagoya Protocol, and the prior informed free consent, and an approach based on rights, we can strengthen the transmission of knowledge, languages, and identity of the peoples, which can contribute to the appropriation of the project for restoration and other important considerations. The disadvantages with this approach have to do with this taking time, and it requires specialized capabilities to gather the data, so it's not always easy to find resources. And normally it's not so easy to consider the local perspective with the macroeconomic, political, national, international context, or with the model scenarios of what's going to happen in the future. For instance, if government is planning to build a gate or a new dam, or if there are 4 degrees of global heating instead of 1.5, what should be done? How will we adapt in the mangroves management? That's why they have co-construction of knowledge, where we see scientists and wise men from indigenous knowledge, with local knowledge, they work together to exchange wisdom and knowledge that is scientific and local to plan and co-build interventions and projects as a whole. This is something new. It's a bit complicated because you need to create a context where there is mutual respect for different knowledge and different ways. It requires roundtables for exchange where we understand how knowledge comes about, which is normally different. And an important point in this regard, starting point, is education. We need to learn not only from the indigenous local knowledge bearers, but scientists need also how to make the most of this knowledge and wisdom from other knowledge systems. So there are ways of having indigenous education where you learn from the elderly on about their ways. We can learn their symbols through arts and songs. learning through stories they have, and also to learn through respect and following their ways. This has been very powerful, and scientists themselves go through these processes. This is a way of incorporating the three elements we're discussing here today. Finally, in the mangrove restoration projects, what we have is projects in different countries, 6 or 7 countries that are participating with the project, and each country covers the topic in a different manner. For instance, in Mexico, they are having activities in the communities because it's very important to take into account the transmission of indigenous and local knowledge is always more powerful at the mangroves themselves, not necessarily the best context for conveying indigenous knowledge in a different type of classroom. So what I would like to do now is to conclude my introduction. It's been a bit long, and perhaps now to pass on the word to the two panel members so they can themselves share their experiences and knowledge on this topic, and then we can have an exchange at the end on this very point. So, my very first panel member here with us, Tatiana Pizzi Reynoso. I don't have much information about you, Tatiana, so you have the floor to introduce yourself, and we'll hear your presentation then. Thank you, Serena, for your introduction, and it is great for today's topic. My name is Tatiana Pisi. I work in international relations. I had a degree from the University of Rosario and a magister on sustainable development in Sussex University. I'm here to share with you the study of, of a specific case related to the implementation of a methodology for a citizens participation strategy. So let me now share my screen with the presentation.
Just let me know if you can see my screen. Yes, we can see your screen. Okay, great. Just see. Is it in presentation mode?
No, Tatiana, todavía no.
No, not yet, Tatiana. Let me see if I can find the right button. Okay, we are all set now. So thank you very much for this invite and share with you this final webinar of the cycle that Christian mentioned. My presentation is a methodological and theoretical approach to think about the implementation of citizen engagement or participation in restoration and conservation of ecosystems like the mangroves ecosystems. This is the agenda, let's say, or the context. First of all, I'm going to give you a quick overview about planning and participation of citizenship to key characteristics of citizen engagement, like, for example, the principles and the levels of citizen participation and the different steps of the methodology for the preparation and implementation of a citizen participation strategy for a specific case that was used in the northwest of Argentina, and then some findings or conclusions that will help um, fuel the debate. So first of all, why are we talking about citizen participation, both globally and in the region? Because we are faced with an unprecedented context and the hegemonic growth and the monetization of the context where the environment becomes a commodity with abundance of resources show that the nature itself is earned through economic processes and therefore it is consumed as a commodity. So mercantilization of the land and resources lead to different social injustices associated to their lands. However, we see an increasing empowerment of local and indigenous communities that seek through democratic instruments to participate in different environments. The possibility of dialogues among different stakeholders representing different power positions is a key component to succeed in having the respect of human rights and better qualities in the different territories. That's why we can talk today about a new paradigm, governance, a new governance paradigm, intercultural paradigm, where citizen engagement and the development of strategies of citizen engagement play a key role. This new model uh, includes the participation of different stakeholders, the dialogue as the democratic approach, and to enter into agreements that, for political reasons, reach agreement about the social, economic, and natural conditions existing in the ecosystems and livelihoods in the communities. And any citizen participation strategy is based on different principles that are strategic guidelines for the methodology. For example, how to organize a citizen participation process. This is the list of all the principles. I think that they are quite straightforward and self-explanatory. First of all, the first one, the principle of transparency and access to information. With regard to this principle, in any citizen participation, it should be a proactive, providing information about the different objectives, budget, etc. And the condition for different groups and people to participate in a sustainable manner is to have timely and understandable information and access to the information in order to be well informed about the topic, finding common points between local knowledge, indigenous knowledge, and environmental public instruments. The second principle that I would like to highlight is respect for diversity. Participation implies recognizing different knowledge, visions with regard to the specific topic. In this case is the conservation and restoration of different ecosystems like the mangroves. The different approaches and visions should have a place for being proposed and should be valued in an equal footing. This implies ensuring representation, equitable representation of indigenous communities in the governance processes, strengthening their strengths, and to participate in intercultural decisions. The second characteristic, and let me go very quickly about this, is that citizen participation processes have different levels, and it's very important to understand the level for the implementation of the strategy of this type of participation in order not to generate expectations that won't be accomplished. Well, the levels have to do with different complexity levels. First of all, information level. This implies delivering information to the citizens about the processes that are being carried out. Many authors consider that this is not a citizen participation level because it's just providing the information. There is no engagement, but delivering a decision is a minimum participation approach. The consultation level is the second level, is the most frequent, is the second step in this complexity ladder. And we invite different citizens for consultation, gather their opinions about a specific proposal. It's not a binding approach, but the recommendation is that the final decision should be communicated to the community and why different measures were adopted. Third, the decision-making level. So the participants do have a direct impact in the decision-making process. Their opinions are binding. A clear example could be, for example, a referendum, submitting something to the opinion of the citizens, and the co-management level involving co-management between representatives and the community. So those that have participated in consultative and decision-making steps also participate in this co-management level. So taking into account these theoretical components, let me go into the methodology itself for the development of a citizen participation strategy. I am not going to describe the specific characteristics because of some time constraints, but if you need more information, I can then share with you more information. I would like to highlight, however, that well, to try to extrapolate these different steps of the methodology in a specific case. First of all, we talk about the preparation and strategic assessment steps to consider whether we are in a good condition to carry out a citizen participation strategy. Then preparation and approval of the strategy, including, for example, feedback of the consultation processes, and then the implementation and assessment of the strategies. So in order to describe or put this into context, I am going to use a case study, the conservation of Salinas Grandes and Huayllay Lagoon in the northwest of Argentina. So, and this is integration of local knowledge and wisdom in participation processes. This is the conservation project of this salt marsh. This basin is between the provinces of Salta and Jujuy, 4,000 meters above sea level. There are 33 indigenous communities of Atacameño and Collas. This implies 6,500 people living in the basin and from the basin, and their livelihood is extracting salt and cattle raising. So the salt marshes are very fragile. They've been subject to extractivism, hyper extractivism like lithium extraction that have different and strong impacts on the ecosystem. For example, water shortage, fragility or weakness of the system, or weakness of the environment due to different machinery, heavyweight machinery, and the dwells. And then we can also say that brackish water have to be destroyed in order to obtain lithium. So this is a critical situation, and based on the indigenous cosmovision, and I quote this, any intervention in the environment is potentially risky because it can distort or even break the complex network of reciprocal relationships built with nature through day-to-day rituals and practices. So against this scenario, the local communities, Atacameño and Nicoya, and based on this cosmovision, these communities started to hold meetings since May 2010, and they established a community group for discussion, and they meet monthly to address, for example, lithium industry and other related matters associated to community matters, including, for example, some spiritual and spaces for reflection. They have a smaller group with representatives of the area as an executive board, and also professionals from different universities, national universities of Salta, Jujuy, and lawyers to support these indigenous communities. So this was the preparation stage. They discussed where the appropriate conditions for developing a strategy were in place or not. It was important at this stage to have access to clear and understandable information by all the stakeholders, that is to say, their roles in the group, and fulfillment of the other citizen participation principles, for example, voluntarism, non-exclusion, respect for diversity within the group or small round table. There was some training that was carried out, approximately 30 training sessions. The purpose was basically to strengthen the basic knowledge of the communities based on indigenous environmental and human rights, enforcement of the rights, and other criteria. And members of other communities were invited to exchange their experiences, particularly in connection with indigenous rights, and proposing overreaching or measures. As a second stage, the preparation and implementation and approval of the strategy, citizen participation strategy. In 2016, the small group submitted to the provincial government and the consultation group what we call as Huellas de Sal, which is a preliminary approval and free referendum to bring together their claims of recognition and participation. So the preparation of this strategy at the time of submission included recommendations of different voluntary and non-exclusive recommendations from the 33 communities of the basin. So given the specific reality during the decision and consultation stages, this is a consultation protocol that seeks to be binding for local and national authorities. We strengthen the free and informed representation respecting the principles of access to the information.
The protocol pretends to integrate local and indigenous knowledge on how we know and we act on the environment, and how to integrate global scientific knowledge as an input for decision makers. The construction of community policies is essential for thinking this protocol as a basis for standards and mechanisms for the protection of the indigenous people. The model looks for an integral view of Pachamama as space, time, matter, and spirit, where human life is meaningful when developed together with others. And the protocol presents a very special way for thinking the consultation process of the salts. They use an analogy with the harvesting process of the salt and the consultation process that they incorporate with the different stages in salt processing, preparation of tools, of the sinks, the nursing of the salt, the crystallization, harvesting, related to the consultation process right after the drying of the salt. This consultation process, as follows the salt process, as they call it, is considered dynamic and can be modified on the way. This way, the protocol is not only a formal tool for consultation, but it's a way of merging ancestral salt, land, or plains management with the knowledge in the territory. With this, there's a new governance model for natural resources in the region and co-construction of knowledge, as it was clearly expressed by Serena in the introduction. This strategy has not yet been instrumented by or implemented by authorities, but there is an alternative view on the looking at the territory and the communities. Cachi Shupi is the first bio community cultural protocol for Argentina, and it's essential for rethinking governance and environmental management. Considered now very clearly, we see conclusions here for the debate. Now we are to think on the elaboration and implementation of a transparent participatory strategy. We need to leverage the value of indigenous peoples' heritage, promoting their vision of development and good living. Kachishupi, as we've seen, and it's essential to acknowledge their collective rights and work with a specific approach starting from the people's identity to value the contributions of their scientific knowledge, fostering knowledge towards sustainable development, and the contribution of this knowledge to sustainable development is enrooted in their capacity to promote practices and solutions respecting the limits of the environment, promoting social equity of the peoples in these territories, integrating this knowledge in decision-making processes and development approaches can help tackle challenges like climate change, loss of biodiversity, and inequality in this diverse Latin America that we have. That was all in my presentation. Thank you very much, and I will remain for the Q&A session. Thank you. Thank you, Tatiana. As you very well mentioned at the beginning, I believe this was a very good example on co-constructing knowledge. The citizens' participation is very important. We have been discussing it at other contexts, not here. That is to say, citizens' science, and there's also a big potential for developing what we call extreme citizens science. That is to say, no longer thinking of citizens as helping out or assisting scientists, but equal partners in the process of elaborating science as a process. And with this, we're talking about new models for managing the production of knowledge as from indigenous peoples as well. So that was an example of how this can be managed. let me highlight once again the relevance of safeguards not to repeat patterns of inequality that are so naturalized by many of us, and we can repeat this without noticing even. So that's another relevant need for having strategies and protocols to ensure that we are breaking these models that are pretty common. Now, let me pass the floor to Silvio Cabreras, manager at the Biosphere Reserve Macizo del Cajas at Ecuador. He is here to tell us about the management plan for mangroves at this biosphere reserve, in particular the crab collecting communities and their role in this project for the restoration of mangroves. Silvio, we hear you. Good morning. Can you hear me well? Yes, we can. We can, Silvia, we hear you. All right, so I want to thank you very much for this invitation to share some of the activities that we have been carrying out around the management of our reserve biosphere, Macizo de Cajas. We're going to make a brief introduction of our biosphere, and then we'll talk about the marine and coastal surface with manglers. My name is Silvio Cabrera. I am a manager at Macizo del Cajas Biosphere, and I work for the Ministry of Ecologic Transition, working on topics related to conservation, basically. Good morning. Let me now begin my presentation. The biosphere for Macizo del Cajas. My slides are not running, I'm sorry. Something happened. I'm sorry. Maybe when I started sharing screen, I cannot move on. Oh, there. Here we have a general view that has to do with our biosphere Macizo del Cajas. This is the sixth biosphere created in Ecuador with a surface of 9,666 hectares. We see the marine and coastal territory that it covers almost all of it, more than 777 hectares. We see the mangroves. And here at the center in red, we see the core of the biosphere Macizo del Cajas that is related to Macizo del Cajas National Park, where we have the Andean wetlands in our territory. We have a population of around about 1 million inhabitants throughout the whole of the area of this biosphere, but in the coastal marine area, we have around 5,000 to 6,000 settlers living from the mangrove. Here we see a general scheme of our biosphere, Macizo del Cajas. In the north, this is called, it's a mountain range area. Here we see the Interandean Valley with Cuenca City, for instance, and towards the left in the scheme, we have the marine coastal area made up by 8 nautical miles in the Pacific Ocean. There we can see the diversity that we have, the resources that we have in our whole territory, and the cultural diversity, production diversity, and the exchange of goods and services that takes place in this territory. That's why the approach is that of a sustainable territory. We go from the sea and marine resources all the way up to marshlands in the top of the mountains and the Andean ecosystems and population living within the territory. Here we can see, in more general terms, the zones in our biosphere, Macizo del Cajas. We have the two land core areas in brown. In green, we have the buffer zone, and in light color, we have transition areas, and in blue, the coastal and marine areas of Macizo del Cajas. At the beginning, we were saying that around 77% is in the marine coastal area for Macizo del Cajas biosphere. We have this management plan that has been set up on the basis of the functions of a biosphere reserve, that is to say, conservation, sustainable development, and logistic support related basically to research. The management model for our reserve is determined by roundtables for conservation, different committees, the steering committees and technical committees, and for the core area, we have specific guidelines and regulations for management of our maritime coastal area. Here we see the general scheme on the right, and to the left we see the mangroves area and the coastal marine area. We're now going to discuss this area in particular. The coastal marine area for Macizo del Cajas reserve is made up by 5,300 hectares of mangroves. In this mangroves area, we have settlers in the external area on land, several communities that use the mangroves for their livelihood. Perhaps the model developed for the territory in order to guarantee the conservation of the mangroves ecosystem is to provide value to the ecological value, to the ecological process the mangrove has of harboring crabs. This is a place for the red crab with the greatest reproduction of this type of crab, the red crab in Ecuador. These fishermen, settlers that use this resource are custodians of the mangroves. We have high deforestation at the beginning. Round about 14,000 hectares in this territory were deforested. We see on green the remnants of mangroves. In these remnant areas of mangroves, we have people living there, and they capture and sell the red crabs. This was started around 2012, when in 2013 the biosphere was created for this area, Macizo del Cajas. We started coordinated activities with the organizations related to the artisan fishing and the capturing of red crabs, but this activity were carried out by men, adult men at the time. We didn't have the participation of gender equality, participation of women, nor did we have a process for exchange or a process that would be intergenerational. That is to say, the adults were keeping their knowledge about their activity. There was no knowledge transfer towards the younger people and the future generations. Perhaps the creation of the biosphere as a biosphere area and our participation was a relevant contribution, so that first, the gender approach was added and the participation of all of the community members in these activities. We have found another hurdle, the growth of the population, that is to see the children and the grandchildren of those living from the mangrove were actually over-exploiting the mangrove, exerting direct pressure on on the capacity that was not enough to cover the needs for the whole population. So there were guidelines provided for a diversification of activities around the mangroves. First, our law in Ecuador is so relevant in relation to conservation. And the mangrove is not subject of private appropriation, but it is the state that is the owner of the mangrove system, first of all. Second, there is a there's regulation for the use of mangroves, and the associations and organizations settled there were provided with the custody and use by means of agreements. The state still owns this resource, that is the mangroves, but it is granted to the associations living there around the mangroves to make the use of these resources, but preserving the mangrove with a strategy that's well known, the social forests with social mangroves specific chapter. That is to say, there's a compensation for the preservation and conservation of the mangroves. The state provides a certain amount of resources in exchange of the people preserving the conservation of this ecosystem. This has contributed with having seeding capital, that is to say, investment resources that allow them to develop other types of activities there with sustainable alliance for the capture of the red crabs and the use of the mangroves without at the beginning including women for production because they were only working with house chores. Activities were diversified. That is to say, there was a promotion of the use of the mangrove, not only for capturing red crabs, but also so that it can be used for ecotourism and related activities. People does not only go there to capture crabs, but they invite tourists to observe these activities while capturing the crabs. And within these activities, we were able also to see the presence of other stakeholders, and we see an appreciation of the dolphins in the area and local birds that become an attraction that had to be strengthened, but with their participation. That is to say, that they are not to see only the mangrove for the crab, but the mangrove is to be considered an ecosystem providing other services as well, the scenery, the keeping of the biodiversity, carbon sequestration. It being a barrier from direct impact from the ocean into the shorelines and being a carbon sink in this area, marine and coastal, hurricane management, all of the impacts that can affect this territory. People started considering these opportunities, not only to go get the crabs, but seeing the mangroves as part of an ecosystem providing other services that they can harness. Ourselves as managers are support for these other initiatives, providing orientation and guideline, but the change on the territory, it's in their hands. It's on them because they have other activities around the mangrove ecosystem and they are provided with livelihood. It has changed the economy and the life quality of the people there. So after ecotourism was introduced, also trails were made and work was done so that the boats would not scare away the animals. You can go by means of a boat to a certain point, and then you have to walk to observe the birds and the tasks carried out by the local fishermen and those capturing crabs. And the associations became custodians of the mangroves. These organizations wanted to make the most of these benefits for their own organizations, and they were not able to see this in an integral manner. We had to get organizations organized to share these experiences, and out of this association, we ended up having a general group grouping all of the different small groups in the territory, and it's an organization that articulates the 4 different associations we have now, and we expect in the future to have 8 organizations working around the mangrove. So what did we do to prevent conflicts among local organizations? First, we promoted an ordering and development process for the other organizations, so that besides capturing crabs and bird watching and ecotourism, they could also have the possibility of selling the crabs for food, for instance, as a purpose. So what they were not selling, they were discarding. So now they are reselling, and they are presenting this as food. And they are also working now with companies that freeze the crab meat so that it's not wasted. This crab was not the same quality then to be sold to consumers. So what was done was to obtain further support so that they can vacuum pack the crabs following all of the food security standards in order to sell the crab this way as well. They sell then the crabs for ecotourism, and the remnant crab meat is packed in vacuum to be selling the crab pulp. And the waste remaining was the crab's shell. And we had an agreement so that they can grind this material and they can pound it down to flour. So a small thing that was only capturing crabs by adult males population was diversified into multiple activities in the territory first, and then the opportunity was given for the young people to go to universities, to be educated and acquire scientific knowledge, to come and contribute in other areas, not only capturing crabs. The main point has to do with the health of the mangroves ecosystem. That is to say, this ecosystem needs to be in good ecological conditions to continue to provide these resources in this habitat, and for the people in the territory to see the mangrove as an opportunity, having the mangrove and the resources and benefits associated to it.
Key problem for mangrove laws was the establishment of crab collection pools that were tended in or installed in mangrove areas approximately around the 14,000 miles that we had 40 years ago. Today, we have 5,000 hectares of mangroves, but we entered into agreements with crab associations and crab collectors in order not to move beyond the limited or restricted areas. Another important uh, uh, engagement of the local inhabitants is that they develop their own regulations. So they They put together different partnerships or organizations. They establish their own bylaws. Let's say they have their own articles of association, so they self-regulate the number of participants involved in the activity, the number of crabs captured on a daily basis, and they distribute the different roles and activities. So depending on the type of organization of the different activities, but they are involved in these activities. So as a biosphere, we have contributed, we, we have contributed we have contributed by allowing them to empower themselves, but reassess, revalue the resources of the mangrove. These are different slides. Silvio, thank you very much. So if you can round up, please, 2 minutes. So key economic activities, as I mentioned before, are the ones that I have mentioned. There are, however, some threats in the territory: reduction of mangroves, illegal fishing, contamination of streams, piracy, other related problems. But we try to identify these problems and find participation alternatives as a state, as a biosphere, in order to support their activities. Another thing that I mentioned before is the law. That is to say, we have entered into local agreements and they have their own bylaws. These are the different stakeholders involved, from the central level to different organizations, partnerships, consumers, and we as the central state in our way of participating. Thank you very much for this. So thank you very much, Silvio, and thank you for sharing with us this new, very interesting biosphere. Let me underscore some items of your presentation. First of all, I would like to underscore the importance of diversification, because over the years, mangrove production has been concentrated only in the harvest of crabs, and quite often traditional production is diversified. Sometimes we see the result of including local and indigenous knowledge. We see different and diversified products and very sensitive to the impacts that they have on the environment. So it's very good to have this type of introduction of different economic activities from a diversified economy, and how we can introduce, or how we can establish this link between ancestral knowledge and the elderly and the young, which can be a very interesting and important activity in the conservation of biosphere, because this knowledge, passing of knowledge among the generations, has different impacts that go beyond environmental or economic impacts that have to do with identity appropriation impacts and the consolidation of the communities, the pride of the communities, which is the core and the foundation of positive identity construction. So that is one of the most important impacts. The participatory work and sharing local and ancestral and indigenous knowledge. And it allows us to move aside from this idea, scientific knowledge, world class versus which are the best, and local and indigenous knowledge that are downgraded. We need to change this dynamic. We need to work with both knowledge systems that are at an equal footing, and this exchange among peers is where we will find some value. And we need to change our mindset as well and switch this use of language, integration of local and indigenous knowledge, and put them as part of the scientific knowledge. No, we are exchanging two knowledge systems that are both valuable. And when we have this balance, the wise men, the elderly become more respected. And this results in stronger communities. I would like then to highlight this important. We need to have strong communities as the core, consistent communities that have a sense of their value, of their importance, that they feel proud of their own identity. And now I would like to open the floor to questions or comments from the participants. Also, there is a Q&A chat box where you can write your own questions or your own comments. Any questions? If not, I have a couple of questions for the two speakers. My question, and it goes for both of you, a general question for both of you. In your in the work between the communities or indigenous people, in this work of working in these committees, participatory committees, which was the most severe or the most difficult challenge in order to succeed in these planning of the committees? Tatiana, the floor is yours first. Thank you, Serena, Silvio. Thank you very much for your presentation. I also have a question for you, but let me first address Serena's question. Based on the research, the greatest challenge rests, well, in addition to reaching consensus, because we are talking about communities that live in the same territory, do the same type of activities, but nonetheless, there are some conflicts among the villages, in this case, Atacameños and Coyes in the northwest of Argentina. So it's about reaching consensus as part of their difference, this construction of identity, Serena, that you were talking about. And the other key challenge was communication with the provincial and national authorities from the local communities, because there is this prejudice or this barrier that we often see, this difficulty of being on an equal footing between indigenous local knowledge and scientific knowledge. So I think that these two are the greatest challenges in our case study. Silvio, the floor is yours. I share your point, but something that is part of or intertwined, but we need to make it visible. In our particular case, in our case of the Macizo del Cajas biosphere, we are a support to the processes that need to be carried out on site. So we will better guide, taking into account or benefiting from the scientific knowledge, but the scientific knowledge has to be applied to the reality of each and every territory. We have a general scientific knowledge, but we need uh, to have a better diagnosis of each community, territory, and site, because all the communities are different. The interest may be general or similar, but they have their specific characteristics given their own realities. As managers and support, we are not going to change the reality, but we will strengthen their reality so that they become the drivers of their own destiny. And that should be the difference between what we are doing and what we would like to do. It's not about what we would like, but what the local communities need in their territories. And then value their ancestral and local knowledge that is being lost. We need to recover the historical memory that helped the communities develop. And we need to recover and revalue and give this added value to the science into the ancestral knowledge so that the inhabitants of these places can have a better way of living. Because we can continue discussing, but if we don't change their reality, the reality on site, if they don't have food, if they don't have livelihoods, if they cannot feed their children, uh, we can continue doing research, but the reality won't change too much. We need to incorporate the people, that they become their own driver. But then we need to articulate and connect this with the scientific knowledge. But this mechanism of conveying knowledge and reaching people has to be uh, environmental friendly and friendly to the communities. We cannot speak in a complicated manner because the people on site don't understand us. We need to use a language that is easy for them to understand, that they feel identified, because they will perform the change. It's not about us. We will always be their support. Thank you. Thank you, Tatiana. Thank you, Silvio. I have a question on the chat, and then I will ask Tatiana to, can you expand on the incentive for the communities in exchange for protecting the wetlands? Perhaps this question goes to Silvio. Since 2009, we implemented a program called Voluntary Incentives for Conservation. If a citizen, for example, owns a piece of land that is very important for conservation purposes, and it includes weak ecosystems, we assess the territory and we say the potential of this territory is N because it's, for example, for water recharge, or there is significant biodiversity, or it's a weak ecosystem that is described in other conservation concepts. We will provide you with some monthly incentives so that you uh, keep this ecosystem. And the responsibility of the owner is to keep it in good condition, monitor and develop its production activities outside the conservation. We define the zone, we define the permanent conservation or protection and use areas, and we provide the owner with a benefit, an economic benefit, or if we are talking about organizations, at the end of the year, we do some investment planning meetings. The whole community is meets, and they list the key uh, activities. We have $1,000, for example. How are we going to invest? We defined priorities. For example, it may be conservation or social support or production systems or other activities. At the end of the year, then we hold a meeting, which is an accountability meeting. And as part of this meeting, we analyze the initial investment need, and all the members of the organization should become beneficiaries. They set their own priorities, and they report at the end of the year. It's an accountability and participatory process, and we check that the resources have been correctly used, and we put together some minutes, and this is the guarantee for delivering or granting benefits the following year. And this is part of an 20-year agreement for conservation purposes. It includes different nearby areas that are being threatened, and for the development of the communities that live in these areas. Thank you. And now Tatiana's question for Silvio, and then we will wrap up with some closing remarks by Christian. Actually, my question has to do with, well, great presentation. I like what you said about this creation of different partnerships to share good practices and avoid duplicating errors. My question then is this type of partnership a place where the different organizations and the different communities and villages, do they have a possibility to raise the shares that they consider relevant for the territory? I don't know if I'm making myself clear. For example, you listed different threats, right? I would like to know if this is the outcome of a scientific discussion, or if it is also an outcome of also the local knowledge.
Yes, the idea of having an overarching organization grouping the different organizations has to do with getting them organized instead of having them working separately. They work together jointly this way. In relation to the threats you were mentioning, we have the threat of pirates that go capture crabs, they steal their boats from them, and this was discussed by means of workshops with the different organizations, and they get organized to defend their territory and their resources, and the state is a guarantor and providing support, of course, with limitations that we have. But the idea is to work with the Navy, with the environmental police that we have, and we provide support to prevent external impacts they are having. But one of the biggest threats we had and still present was the losing of the manglers. But by reaching agreement with the big fishing vessels, they cannot get closer. This has to do with restoration of their territories, but with the participation of people, because the state has limiting resources for controlling purposes. So the control and participation is together with the people because they have seen and appreciated the value of the mangrove and the loss that we were having. With losing the mangroves, they lost a certain amount of crabs that they needed for their livelihood. So they are interested in recovering the mangroves, improving the activities and the services that are derived as from the mangrove. State support considering the local realities. Understood. Thank you, Silvio. Thank you so much, both Tatiana and Silvio, for your very interesting presentations. These are two different examples from different countries, different scales, from what I said at the beginning, how to set up these instances for co-creation of knowledge and also the challenges that are faced in coming up with true exchanges that are peer-to-peer, because we have a very long history of privileging one type of knowledge over the other. Nevertheless, with indigenous education and appreciating even more the different types of knowledge, we can develop and generate solutions that are innovative, covering one of the main gray areas that we are facing, for instance, the biodiversity and the climate crisis. Now, to conclude, let me thank Cristian Bravo from UNESCO for organizing this meeting, and we pass the floor on to you, Cristian. Thank you, Serena. I want to thank our panel members, Silvio and Tatiana. Thank you for sharing your experiences with our audience. We're having now 86 attendees, 87. Now you're asking through the chat. The whole series in Spanish and in English is going to be in UNESCO Santiago web page. You're going to have that information shared with you once you're registered so that you can get access to all of these materials. And we're going to have reports with the main interventions and topics touched upon in these meetings, starting on the International Day of Mangrove, June 26th. There were different topics covered in the conversation. It would have been a pleasure to have a representative from a local community of indigenous people participating in the project. Unfortunately, they have very poor connection. It's very difficult to contact them. We pushed over the meetings, but we couldn't get to have them present with their voices and their experience. That's why the presentations we have seen today had to do with the opportunities as from the state and the coordination that the civil society can do to open up the space for the co-creation of knowledge that Serena was mentioning. We expect to solve this topic and the next coming series for the next year with more results from the project. We expect to have the representative from these indigenous peoples to speak about their own experiences, considering what Silvia was saying and Tatiana and Serena as well. How can we provide solutions with striking a balance in the knowledge so that the ancestral ways of life can be passed on, and that the balance needed is achieved by means of conversation, dialogue with the different views. Once again, let me thank the panel members, Silvia and Tatiana, and Serena as a moderator. Thank you, everyone. Have a good rest of the day. We will be sending you the link with the webinars in YouTube, and we will let you have also the report that will be prepared about all these seminars. Thank you very much. Thank you. Goodbye, everyone.